My name is James Calloway, and I want to start by telling you something that took me 31 years and one completely ordinary Thursday afternoon in a coffee shop in Portland, Oregon, to fully understand. The story of where you come from is not the same as the story of who you are. I know that sounds like something you'd read on a motivational poster. I know it sounds easy from the outside, but I am telling you it is true because I lived the long way to it, through every birthday that felt like a question with no answer, through every school form that asked for family medical history and left me with blanks I couldn't fill, through every well meaning person who said, "Have you ever thought about looking for her?" As if the thought had somehow not occurred to me in 31 years of being a person she had left behind. I was abandoned at birth, not left on a doorstep. I want to be specific because specificity is the only honest thing. I was born at Providence Hospital in Portland, Oregon, on a Thursday in February. My mother held me once, according to the nurse who later told my adoptive parents what she was permitted to tell them, for approximately 20 minutes. Then she signed the paperwork that needed signing and she left the hospital, and she did not come back. I was 3 days old. The Callaways, Richard and Susan, adopted me when I was 5 weeks old. They were 41 and 39, respectively, had been trying to have children for a decade, and had arrived at adoption with the particular combination of grief and hope that I would only fully understand much later when I had the emotional vocabulary to recognize it. They were good people. I want to say that clearly and without qualification, because it matters to the story, and it matters to me. They were warm and present, and they loved me with the specific completeness of people who had waited a long time for someone to love. They told me I was adopted when I was 5 years old. They sat me down on the couch in our living room, in the way parents sit down for important conversations, both of them, together, facing me, and they told me that I had been chosen, that another woman had given birth to me and had not been able to care for me, and that they had chosen me and loved me, and I was theirs completely. I received this information at 5 years old, with the practical acceptance that children have for large facts they cannot change. I said, "Okay." I asked if I could have a snack. Susan laughed and said yes. And that was that for a while. It became more complicated when I was older. Not because of anything Richard and Susan did. They were consistent and loving and never made me feel like the adoption was a wound in the family that needed to be managed carefully. They talked about it openly when I brought it up and gave me space when I didn't. They were, in the specific way that matters most, exactly what parents are supposed to be. The complication came from inside me and from the particular cruelty of adolescence, which has a way of finding the unresolved questions in a person and pressing on them until they produce pain. When I was 14, a boy in my class named Derek said in front of a group of people that my real mother hadn't wanted me. He said it the way 14-year-old boys say things without thinking about what it costs the person on the receiving end, or perhaps thinking about it exactly and saying it anyway, which is its own kind of cruelty. I did not respond. I walked away. I went home and sat in my room, and I did not tell Richard or Susan because I did not want them to see that the thing Derek said had gone in, which it had. Even though I knew it wasn't the whole truth, even though I understood, at 14, that the reasons a woman leaves a 3-day-old baby are complicated and numerous and cannot be reduced to didn't want him. I understood all of that. It still went in. I spent the next 17 years in a complicated relationship with the question of my biological mother. There were years when I thought about her constantly, constructed versions of her in my mind, assigned her reasons, gave her faces borrowed from women I saw on the street who had a quality I couldn't name. There were years when I deliberately did not think about her, when I packed the question into a corner of myself and kept it there through sheer force of attention directed elsewhere. I went to the University of Oregon. I studied journalism, which in retrospect makes perfect sense. Journalism is the practice of finding out what actually happened and why. And I had been trying to answer those questions about one specific event since I was old enough to ask them. I graduated. I got a job at a paper in Portland and came back to the city where I had been born and left and found and kept. And I built a life there that was genuinely good. Friends, work I cared about, an apartment I liked, and the question, always in the background. Not screaming, just there. When I was 28, I started the search. Not impulsively. I had been thinking about it for years, and I started it when I felt ready, which is a thing people told me to wait for, and which I had been skeptical about, but which turned out to be real. I felt ready at 28 in a way I had not felt at 23 or 25. I applied for my original birth certificate, which Oregon law permitted. I contacted the adoption agency through which Richard and Susan had adopted me. I worked with a search consultant named Beverly, who had 20 years of experience, and the patient, methodical approach of someone who understood that the thing at the end of the search was a human being and not just an answer to a question. The birth certificate listed my mother's name as Margaret Chen. Beverly found 3 women by that name in the Pacific Northwest. She narrowed it to 2 through age matching, then to 1 through a combination of hospital records and other information I did not fully track because I had reached the point in the search where the information was arriving faster than I could process it. Her name was Margaret Chen. She was 53 years old. She lived in Portland. In Portland, she had been living in the same city as me for 9 years. I sat with that information for 6 weeks before I decided what to do with it. Beverly offered to make contact on my behalf, which was the professional and emotionally protected way to proceed. I said I needed to think about it. I thought about it for 6 weeks. What I kept returning to in those 6 weeks was the question of what I actually wanted from her, not what I wanted from the search. The search had given me a name and an address and the factual answer to the factual question. But what I wanted from her, from the meeting, if there was a meeting, from the conversation, if there was a conversation. I did not want an apology, or I did not only want an apology. I wanted to understand. I wanted to look at the person who had held me for 20 minutes in a hospital room 31 years ago and see if the understanding I had always constructed in my head, the complicated reasons, the difficult circumstances, the love that was real, even if the capacity to stay was not. I wanted to see if that understanding was true, or if I had been generous with someone who did not deserve it. I was still sitting with that question on a Thursday afternoon in October when I walked into a coffee shop on Morrison Street that I had been going to for 2 years and ordered my usual and sat at the table by the window that I usually sat at and opened my laptop. The woman at the table next to mine was reading a book. I noticed her the way you notice people in coffee shops, briefly, without much attention. She was in her early 50s, with dark hair going gray at the temples, wearing a gray sweater and reading glasses pushed up on her head. She had a cup of tea in front of her. I opened my email. Beverly had sent me a message that morning with an attachment, a photograph she had found, a public photograph from a community event. Margaret Chen, identified by name in the caption. I opened the attachment. I looked at the photograph. Then I looked at the woman at the table next to mine. My whole body went still, in the way that bodies go still when something enormous has just happened, and the mind has not yet caught up to it. She had not looked up from her book. I sat there for what felt like a very long time, and was probably 45 seconds, during which I had approximately 11,000 thoughts in rapid sequence, most of them contradictory. Leave. Stay. Say something. Say nothing. This is a coincidence. This is not a coincidence. This is the city where I was born and where she has lived for however many years. And this coffee shop is 2 miles from the address Beverly gave me. And of course it is not a coincidence. She turned a page. I said, "Excuse me." She looked up. I looked at her face. Her eyes, dark, behind the reading glasses she had pulled down, were my eyes. Not similar, not reminiscent. My eyes. The same specific shape, the same color, the same quality of attention in them that I had been told my whole life was distinctive and particular. I said, "I'm sorry. I don't know how to do this. I don't know if there is a right way to do this." I paused. "My name is James Calloway. I was born at Providence Hospital on February 9th, 31 years ago. And I think you might be my mother." The reading glasses came off. She looked at me for a long moment. Her face was doing something complicated and internal, the way faces do when something has arrived that a person has both dreaded and prepared for, and still finds themselves completely unprepared for in the actual moment. She said, "James." Not a question, not surprise. My name, said in a specific way, the way you say a name you have been carrying for a long time. I said, "Yes." She put both hands over her face. She sat like that for a moment. Then she lowered them and looked at me, and her eyes were full, and she said, "I have looked for you. I want you to know that. I looked for you for years, and the records were closed, and I have thought about you every single day since the day I left that hospital." I looked at this woman, my mother, the person whose face contained the explanation for my own face, the person whose 20 minutes with me had become 31 years of questions. I said, "Tell me why." She told me. It took 2 hours, 2 cups of tea on her side and 2 coffees on mine, and the coffee shop emptying around us as the afternoon moved toward evening. She told me about being 22 and alone and frightened in a way she had not had the resources to manage. She told me about a mother who had said she would not support her if she kept me, which was its own kind of cruelty that I had not factored into my 31 years of constructed reasons. She told me about signing the paperwork and walking out of the hospital and sitting in her car for an hour before she could drive, which was a detail that landed somewhere specific in me because I knew what it was to sit in a car, unable to drive, because something too large had just happened. She told me she had gotten her life together slowly, and then less slowly, and then she had looked for me, and the records were closed, and she had eventually, painfully, made a kind of peace with not knowing. She had never stopped thinking about me. I listened to all of it. When she finished, I was quiet for a long time. I looked out the window at the Portland street outside, the October evening coming down over the city where both of us had been living for years, without knowing we were getting coffee 2 miles apart. I said, I had good parents. I want you to know that. Richard and Susan. They were good. She said, I hoped. I always hoped. I said, I'm not ready to know what this is yet. I don't know what I want from it, but I needed you to know that I exist, that I turned out okay, that the 20 minutes you held me, I needed you to know they weren't the whole story. She nodded. Her eyes were full again. I gave her my phone number. I got hers. I walked out of that coffee shop into the October evening and stood on Morrison Street, in the city where I was born and left and found and kept. And I breathed the cold air, and I felt, underneath everything, the specific relief of a question that has been answered. Not resolved, answered. Those are different things. I know where I come from now. It does not change who I am, but it is lighter than not knowing. And lighter is enough. If James' story moved you, share it with someone who is carrying the weight of an unanswered question. Subscribe to Televera for more honest, emotional stories about identity, family, and the courage it takes to find out where you come from. Leave a comment below. Have you ever searched for something or someone you weren't sure you were ready to find? Tell us. We are listening to every single one.